this meetup group is actually in its third life, and its third life began in April 2009.
Yeah, sounds right.
And there were 5 people there. Me, Travis, and I don't remember the other people.
Eliza Brock.
Eliza was there.
Mm-hmm.
And was it at Portland Brew?
Portland Brew.
Yeah, it was at Portland Brew. So Travis is a co-organizer along with Kevin Old, with the 3 co-organizers. And he's awesome, and he's presenting. And here you go.
Thanks, Josh. All right, blues first. Okay, good. So my talk, it's titled Rails Asset Pipeline Better, Faster, Stronger, but it's really more about how to supplement the Rails Asset Pipeline. So my info, I work for, like I said, a company called GoNoodle.com. That's my Twitter username and my email address if anybody wants to get in touch with me. So the Rails Asset Pipeline. A lot of people have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with the Rails Asset Pipeline. And most of it is more hate than it is love. Compilation time is really, really slow. If we deploy our code without asset compilation, it takes, and this is deploying to Engineer Cloud, a minute maybe. If we do it with asset compilation, it's up to like 7 minutes, 8 minutes. I mean, it's crazy how much time it takes to compile assets. The alternatives, there are alternatives to the asset pipeline. You could completely turn off the asset pipeline if you want. You could use Bower to package libraries, external libraries. You could use something like Gulp or Grunt to compile assets. We played around a little bit at GoNoodle with trying to switch to Gulp and Grunt. We tried Gulp. We had a lot of problems because we still needed to have some assets that were in gems, like active admin, things like that. So we ran into a lot of problems where we couldn't just tear out the asset pipeline and we really couldn't get them to play well with each other. So I'm not really going to cover these alternatives, I just want to make you aware of them. Instead, I'm really going to talk about how we can improve what we already have. So the first option is railsassets.org. I don't know if any of you guys have used this, but it's kind of a poor man's Bower. It actually uses Bower, so it's a way to get Bower without actually having another package manager installed. And really what this does is it solves the problem of, I'm sure everybody who's ever worked on an app has gone and found a JavaScript library they want to use. They've downloaded it and they put it in their vendor folder. And then 2 years later, they're 50 versions behind on that vendor library because they just stuck it in their vendor assets folder and forgot about it. So it's way out of date. So this can help with that. And like I said, all it does is it will convert a Bower package to a gem that will make the assets available to the asset pipeline. And using it is super duper simple. All you have to do is have this source block in your gem file and set your source to railsassets.org. And anywhere inside that block, if you have a gem that starts with rails-assets, anything after that second dash will be the Bower package name. So what that will do is on bundle install, and I believe there's one little caveat that you have to bundle 184 or greater, I think, to work with this. But the way it works is when you run bundle install, it will go through this list of gems. It will go fetch the Bower repo. It will grab the file that's listed in the main, the Bower JSON config, and it will package that as a gem so that your app now has a gem with access to the asset in question. So once you have that set up and you do bundle install, then in your JS and CSS manifest, you can do things like require jQuery, require moment, require bootstrap, and all of that stuff is in your app as a gem, and Rails Assets takes care of that. So the next option is Turbo Sprockets Rails 3. It's a gem. And as you can probably tell, this only works for Rails 3. There's an issue on the GitHub repo where someone asked about Rails 4, and the author claims that all the problems that it tries to solve have been solved in Rails 4, but I couldn't find evidence of that. I as a disclaimer also, our app is written in 3.2, Rails 3.2. So I really only have experience working with Rails 3.2. I haven't worked with Rails 4 over it much or anything past that. So it might be solved in Rails 4, I don't know. And basically what TurboSprocket's Rails 3 does is it is smart enough to where, so if you, to use it, you just add it to your assets group in your gem file. And what it does is the first time you run asset compile, it creates a manifest file that maps your source files to their hashed fingerprint compile files. And on subsequent compiles, every time you run rake assets compile, what it will do is it will look at that manifest and it will say, has this file changed? Yes, I need to compile it. Has this file changed? No? Okay, I'm going to skip it. I'm not going to compile it again. So it's a little bit smarter about what to compile. So if you are changing one file most of the time, like a style sheet or a main JavaScript, that should be the only file that gets recompiled every time you do deploy. So it will speed up your deploys quite a bit unless you're changing all of your assets. It does require an extra step for Capistrano and Heroku. So if you're deploying with Capistrano or you're deploying with Heroku, Capistrano is as easy as, I think, just including an extra library in your deploy script. Heroku, you actually have to use a custom build pack that the guy wrote for Heroku that will use the TurboSprocket's Rails 3 benefits. We tried this briefly at GoNoodle, but we also use require.js Rails so that we can use, because our whole front-end app is JavaScript. So we use require.js with that, and TurboSprocket's Rails 3 would not work with require.js. And there's an issue open on require.js Rails asking to help get it working, and it's been open for several years, I think, and nothing's been done, so I don't hold out hope that it's ever going to work with require.js. So those are just two things to keep in mind. The third option I'm going to talk about is the asset sync gem, and this is actually what we use at GoNoodle with a little bit of extra on top of it. What this does is, it literally, the only thing it does is after compile, it will sync your assets to an S3 bucket. So instead of serving them off of your server, you can serve them off of the S3 bucket. So again, you just have to add it to your gem file, and it uses fog as the gem that talks back and forth between AWS. And they recommend that to optimize the loading of fog, because if you go take a look at fog on rubygems.org, it has a lot of sub-libraries that it loads. It's basically got a library for every possible file storage location, like Engine Yard Cloud, AWS, Brightbox. There's probably 15 of them that it loads every time you require fog. So the asset sync author recommends that you require just the fog AWS storage, and I put it after as optional, but he said it's very important that you put that line before the gem asset sync so that it will load the fog AWS storage before asset sync tries to load all of fog. So that should help your boot times and stuff. And then to use asset sync, you'll need to give it AWS credentials. You can either create a YAML config file if you want, or if you're on Heroku or a server that supports environment variables, you can put all of this stuff in environment variables instead, so that you don't have to worry about either having a dist file in the repo that somebody has to copy over and populate the credentials, or have to worry about having your credentials in your GitHub repo. So the easiest way really is to create a config file, but you can also use config variables. You can use something like Foreman, I think. Well, no, not Foreman. .in will let you create a file in the Ruby project, and it will set environment variables for you when you boot your app. So that's another option. And then you create an initializer. And Asset Sync actually has a script that will create the initializer for you. And you can choose either the Ruby version, the YAML version, or the built-in initializer. And the built-in initializer requires environment variables. So if you're setting all your stuff to environment variables, you don't even need to have an initializer, because the asset config built-in initializer will check for variables, and if they exist, we'll use them. We don't use environment variables, so we have this initializer here, and it's really just loading the AWS config file and then setting the AWS credentials. And then to get your app to serve the assets off of S3, there's really only one line that you need to change, and that's in your production.rb environment config. You just set config action controller asset host to, you can either set it to the subdomain version of your bucket, I think, which is like appassets.s3.amazonaws.com, or you can set it to the regular Amazon AWS/bucket name. And from then on, every time your app requests a asset, it will come from S3 instead of from your server. The benefit of that is so you can have more HTTP connections, getting assets plus loading your code. So hopefully that'll speed up your app a little bit. And so I'll talk about another thing that we use on top of S3, and that's a CDN. And a CDN, if you don't know, is just a content delivery network. And it's just a system of distributed servers that deliver content to users based on geographic location. So these are some popular CDNs. So like Akamai, what they'll do is they'll have a bunch of servers all around the world. And when you upload content to one server, they will propagate it through all the servers. So if somebody is in Australia and they're trying to get a file from your site, they'll get a file from a server that's either in Australia or very close to Australia. So they should get the asset a lot quicker than if they were trying to hit your server, which is maybe in Virginia or Washington or California or something like that, halfway around the world. I'm going to focus on Amazon CloudFront because that's what we use. And CloudFront and S3 work very well together. So what we did was we set up a CloudFront instance that just points to our S3 bucket. And so now we have a CloudFront endpoint that's, say it's foobar.cloudfront.net. So I would go into my production and I would change my asset host to point to CloudFront instead of pointing to S3. And what that does is CloudFront is just pass through to S3. Whenever you request an asset from CloudFront, if it hasn't gotten it from S3 yet, it will go get it and then it will cache it. So the next person who tries to get it will get it directly from CloudFront. And you can set the caching time of the assets that CloudFront holds on to. So all that stuff is configurable. One thing that I wanted to go over real quick was we had a problem with this. This is from a message board on the AWS forums. And it's just basically says if you're in the US standard region, then S3 has an eventual consistency model where they don't copy data to the buckets immediately. It could be up to 5 minutes before you get it. So they said to get around that, you'll use a special URL, the bucket name.s3external1.amazon.aws, and that is immediately available as soon as it's uploaded to S3. And the reason this is a problem for us with CloudFront, if an asset is requested and it's not found, 404s in CloudFront can cache for 5 minutes. So if it hits a 404, even if the asset becomes available a second later, it's going to cache that 404 response for at least 5 minutes. So you just make sure that your CloudFront endpoint is pointing to the correct URL if you're in the US standard region. If you're not in the US standard region, from what I understand, this is not a problem.
Question.
Yes?
So you were deploying your app, that the hash on the whatever JS changed, and pointing to CloudFront, but it hadn't made it to the right S3 thing when it went for it?
Yeah, so it was given 404, which was then being cached for 5 minutes. So that was broken, yeah. And so we changed this around, and it works flawlessly now. So a couple of things to keep in mind. So we have a deploy process that uses a custom rake task that we run locally because we were having problems with pushing all the code, doing the asset compilation on the server, it taking up resources from the server which needed to be used to serve requests. So we have a rake task that will actually compile locally on our machines. It will sync the assets to S3, then it'll clean out the public assets directory so that none of those make it up to the server. And it wasn't working, and we weren't sure why. And then we found out that the public assets manifest YAML file has to be on the server, because that's how Rails maps your source files to whatever their hash version is that have been compiled. And Asset Sync also comes with a rake assets clean task that will grab all the files from S3, look at your current manifest, and delete anything that's not referenced in your manifest. So it's a good thing to run after a couple deploys just to keep your S3 bucket clean. So some helpful config that we also did to get the CDN and asset sync working better for us is you can set custom headers on S3 objects, and CloudFront will mirror whatever headers those are. So whatever headers are set on S3, CloudFront will just forward those onto the browser. So for all of our assets, since our assets are hashed, so if one character in a file changes, the hash signature changes. So what we did was we're giving a cache control of max age of a year. So we're saying to the browser, as soon as you get this asset file, keep it for a year, because we know if it changes, the name is going to be different, so you're not going to try to get this same name again. So it's going to bust the cache itself because the name changes. So go ahead and hold on to that file for at least a year. The other thing that we did was this config gzip compression equals true. And what that will do is, instead of uploading the .js version and the .js.gz version of gzip assets, it will upload the gz version in place of the JS. So the file on the server will be like application hash.js, but the file that's actually there is the application hash.js.gz. The thing to keep in mind is you have to make sure your server understands it has an accepted coding for when it's requesting assets. If it has an accept encoding of content type application GZ or I can't remember what the content type is for GZ, but as long as it understands that it can accept that, those headers get sent to the file so that the server can know to expand the file and deliver it to the browser. So having those gzip assets saves a lot of space and a lot of bandwidth too. And if you use asset sync, you can see when it's syncing your assets, it'll say replacing app.js with app.js.gz, and it'll show you the percentage of savings. And most of our files are between 30 and 50% savings, so that's quite a bit of savings in using the GZ version instead of just the regular Minify.js version.
Question?
Yes, go.
Are there some browsers that don't do GZ?
We have Nginx set up, so it's the server side that's expanding the.
Figure that out.
Yes, so Nginx will grab the file, it understands that it's gzip, it will expand it, and then it will give it to the browser expanded. And so the next thing that you can look at is you can open the network tab of your favorite debugging tool, and you can see something like that. You see all those 0 milliseconds from cache. So reloading page with any asset that was coming from CloudFront, it was very noticeable how much faster our app got just turning on the cache headers and putting it in CloudFront. So it's been a huge help for us, and it's another way that we've tried to add some performance in, and it was fairly easy to do. So does anybody have any questions or comments?
Don't you have some really cool results before and after this was implemented?
I don't have benchmarks, but we looked at it before it got deployed and after it got deployed, and I think before it got deployed, it was several seconds. Like our app is very heavy on JavaScript, so to load in the browser, it was like maybe 2.5 to 3 seconds. And after we deployed this, like on initial load when it was getting new assets, it would still be a second and a half, 2 seconds. But after, it was like maybe half a second, 700 milliseconds. So it cut it down quite a bit and not having to re-retrieve those assets. But I don't have any, like I said, I don't have any concrete benchmarks to show you before and after. Just anecdotal that you got better, much better. Anyone else have any questions?
Can you go over a little bit about how that affects your DNS strategy?
I'm not an ops guy, so no, I can't go over how that affects our DNS strategy.
I'm curious what you mean by that. Like, what are you anticipating as issues in that area?
We use Fastly, and Fastly, I believe,
Yeah, so this is just changing the Rails asset host. That's it. So anytime you try to access an asset within Rails, so if you try to say JavaScript include tag or style sheet, whatever tag, that will hit up the asset host and try to get it from there. So we had no changes whatsoever in our DNS because it was a completely separate URL that was unrelated to our domain. I'm sure we could use our domain, like we want to do cdn.gonoodle.com, we could have, but it's pretty much only seen internally, so we didn't care. Nobody's clicking on a link to download something from the crazy string.cloudfront.net, so it didn't bother us. We didn't have to do any kind of changes to the DNS or anything like that.
Do you ever find there's any cognitive dissonance between the local version of your assets and what ends up being served? It seems like there are a lot of steps in between, like, I write a JavaScript file, write as in save a JavaScript file, right? And then I say, so you guys have some sort of like rate task, like rate deploy, right? And let's just say, even though it's not likely to happen with JavaScript that I write, shit is broken when it gets to GoNoodle.com. Do you ever, is it easy to track down which step of this went wrong? I mean, do you find that sometimes what when you have locally doesn't match what is, like obviously there's going to be some latency in terms of like the cache on the CDN, right? But it just seems like there's a lot of moving parts in
Yeah.
it, and like every app I've ever written, there are enough black magic, or at least to me, like black boxes and moving parts in between, but it definitely seems like you guys have gone out of your way in the interest of speed to add steps in between, like your local file and what gets served to John Q user.
Yeah, we were definitely worried when we started this. We were like, what is going to happen if something isn't available or something is out of sync and the app just doesn't load because it's all JavaScript, so if it can't load one app or it can't load the main JavaScript file, it doesn't work. You're going to see a white screen, that's it. So we were really worried about that, and we did a lot of testing on an LTR server. So I probably did 50 deploys on the LTR server to make sure that everything was working the way we thought it was going to work.
So I'm totally asking for a friend. What does LTR mean?
Oh, long-term release. Sorry, it's a long-term release branch. So it's not a staging server, it's more of a mock production server. So we had that running for several weeks, and we deployed a bunch of times every day to make sure that none of that would happen. And we have not had a single problem where we've had a user write in and say they've seen something wrong with the website, or we've never experienced something wrong with the site because either something didn't get uploaded or something got out of sync with CloudFront or something like that. We've not experienced that at all. It's been in production for probably 3 months now like this, so I feel fairly confident that we shouldn't see anything like that in the future, but who knows with computers, right?
What happens in the case of like the oh shit, again, clearly not with the JavaScript that I write, but like, you write something that you think works one way, and then I don't know, Internet Explorer happens, right? You've already pushed it to production site. How easy is it to roll back? I mean, it's been my experience with CloudFront. It's like there's like the cache invalidation thing that I never feel like I'm doing it right, and it's supposed to be bad to do it.
Yeah, so luckily for us, and we've yet to try to roll back, luckily we haven't had to roll back yet. So the good thing about this whole thing is with the hashed assets, every time one gets uploaded, it's got a completely separate name than the previous version. So you don't have to worry about those getting confused. But if we didn't roll back and we had to change, if we had to roll back and change, it still wouldn't be a problem because it would have a different file. We just had to roll back. As long as we didn't run that rake assets clean, the old file is still in S3 in CloudFront with the hash signature. So if we had to roll back the previous version and deploy, everything's still going to be there ready to go, cached around the world.
I think by default, rate assets clean will actually be the previous 4 versions
Yeah.
of the asset live. So even if you run it on every deploy,
Yeah.
4 deploys.
Yeah.
So I deployed broken code in 5 steps.
Yes.
Oh, shit.
on the gzip compression, is that a speed gain only when you're deploying to S3? 'Cause you
No,
said
it
you
should
got-
be a speed gain as well for the end user too, because they're downloading the gzip version instead of the full version, I believe.
I thought you said Nginx was decompressing it before it sends.
That's a good question. I have to look into that. Let me get back to you on that. Because, yeah, that is a good question. Because, it was my understanding the server was decompressing it. So I guess there would only be a savings in the wire between S3 and the server. So the
Yeah.
server getting it initially
Okay.
decompressing it and sending it to the user.
You should do it conditionally based on your accepts header. Like if your browser advertises that Nginx accepts gzip, it shouldn't do the decompression.
Oh, so Nginx is smart enough to say, you get the gzip version, whereas the other person gets the JS version. Okay.
Yeah. So
That
yeah,
makes
it's
sense.
also like, it's a page load thing, like it's not, your cable modem, like you don't care if you download a bigger asset, it's more about you getting the asset faster. So it's about the total time to download it, not about the size. Like that's the advantage you're using, especially if you have a giant single page JavaScript app.
Yeah. Yeah, and our, let me see if I can get an idea of how big our main JS file is.
If I have GoNoodle.com, is it loading like this big JS file?
Sorry, say it again?
www.gonoodle.com, is that loading this?
No, you have to be logged in. The marketing site is all just fat Rails templates. You have to be logged in as a user, and then you'll see the actual gigantic. Okay, so our big, well, it's getting it from cache, so I can't tell you how big it is. 368, oh no, I'm sorry, 1.5 megabytes is the size of the main JavaScript, because we use require.js too, so require.js bundles everything in that big application JS. So that was a big reason we needed to speed up the download and the delivery of it, was that we had a humongous JavaScript file. But even with, so I'm looking at the network pane now. Let's get this up here. So maybe you can see, so I don't know if you can see this glare, but it's giving me a 304 not modified for the application JS file, so it's still getting it from, it's still semi-cached, it's just not cached in the browser yet.
Do you find that this approach has changed the way you all compose your assets locally, like for development?
No,
Does it have any effect on your development?
no.
Short of, I guess, modifying ring files and
No, and the one thing that we still need to do is, we've got a lot of assets in the app that aren't being served via the asset pipeline, just things that are in, we store everything in S3, so everything that we serve comes from S3. But we've got a lot of stuff in the app right now that's not going through CloudFront, it's just hitting S3 directly, like icons, background images, things like that. So another thing that we have to do in the future is to move all that stuff to CloudFront and have it go through CloudFront. And one aspect of that is we need to start having cache busting names. So we need to name the file with something that, if it gets replaced, it's a different name. It's not just the same file, because then you have to go through CloudFront, you have to invalidate the cache, and it is a humongous pain in the ass to try to invalidate something on CloudFront, because they won't let you use wildcards. So you have to give it the path to every single asset you want to invalidate for it to invalidate it. And I don't know if you guys use AWS very much, but we have this joke that no matter what you ask for on AWS, it takes an hour. So invalidating cache an hour, building a cloud search index of 1 million items an hour, building a cloud search index of 2 items an hour,
parsing the docs.
an hour. Yep. Yeah, so we need to move towards having all of our in-app assets, not in asset pipeline, they're not compiled everything, that we're just referencing from S3. We need to move that to a strategy. And we've actually got all of our paperclip attachments going through S3 now as well into CloudFront. So that was one change we made. So anything that gets uploaded from the admin comes out of CloudFront now as well, and it has a hash name. We made a little change to the paperclip uploader so that we give it a timestamp name down to the millisecond, so that it gets busted every time somebody uploads. Even if they upload something with the same name, it'll get a new file when it gets uploaded. Anybody else? Yes.
I got one more.
All right.
I just want to keep them. Did you, I can't remember from the beginning of the talk, you all have found a way around vendor libraries, like you're not using Gulp
So
or whatever, or you're not using assets or Rails assets or whatever.
no, we haven't. That's another thing we're working on. We went down the path of trying to add Bower and Gulp at the same time, and it just didn't work, so we took both of them out. But there's no reason we can't use Bower for just the external libraries we're using, and I think that's something that Dave Calhoun is actually very passionate about adding to the app. He's going to go in and make sure that we're using Bower instead of all of these probably 3-year-old vendor JavaScript files that who knows how out of date they are.
I just read that for some guy from some other part of the team who's trying to add like some copy and paste stuff that you're file right window.
Yeah.
I've got a side project where we're using Bower successfully.
Yeah, Bower's great. I love that part of it.
Bower RC into your Rails project,
Mhm.
and you can set the prefix to vendor assets Bower components, put everything in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you just, in your manifest, like your application CSS, and your application JS manifest, you just reference.
Yeah.
Set that in there.
Where are you guys next? Is it Heroku?
I use employees of Heroku, but actually now there's.
You can tell me all that.
So Max, this is a funny story for you. We at GoNoodle, we were hosting all of our stuff on EC2, like ourselves. And it was before I started working there, but every day at like 9 a.m. this app would go down. The site would just go down. Every day at 9 a.m. And they could never figure out what it was. And so finally they were like, enough EC2, no more EC2, we're moving to Heroku. And our ops guy,
So nobody told the CEO that Heroku was just EC2.
oh, well, we didn't mind because it was managed. So we finally said, we're moving to Heroku, today's the day, and our ops guy was like, fine, I'm tired of managing this, let's let somebody else do it. Heroku was down that day. So we ended up on Engine Yard.
Not my fucking problem.
So we ended up hosting an Engine Yard, and that's where we've been for probably 2 years now, and it's worked out well. Again, it's just a layer on top of EC2, but they take care of all the hard stuff for us. Yes, Gabe.
You mentioned having old JavaScript files, like it's a really bad thing. I'm just kind of curious to hear. I guess in my mind, JavaScript, there's not really much of a security issue there, probably, with most of what you're dealing with.
So most of the stuff that we're missing out on is new features. So we use a couple of libraries for transitions, and if one of the front-end guys are here, they can tell you more, but there's a lot of JavaScript files that we're missing out on update features. Marionette's another one. We've got, I think we're using Marionette or Length or 0.3 maybe, and there's a newer version of Marionette. We've had to go back and monkey patch our version because it doesn't have the new version it has for this one specific use case. If we had a new version, we wouldn't have to worry about it, it would work fine, but we've had to go back and patch our version because it would take a lot for that upgrade. So it's mostly just new features. We don't really, again, we've not come across any security issues in an old version of any of our JavaScript libraries. It's all new features that we're missing.
I would say another use case would be ES6 stuff. Like if you're trying to write ES6 JavaScript, you're going to want that to be up to date with the latest specs for ES6. You know, if you write something, it's going to be working over that.
All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.